Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all here today. I'm John Carlson. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I'm delighted to welcome you to our event this afternoon. If you've been to events such as this in the past, you know I oftentimes like to start with a little joke. It just brings back these memories of childhood when all the other kids laughed at me. Makes me real kind of. But it's the case that yesterday I blew out my knee, and this is not part of a joke. I mean, it's kind of bad. It makes me feel a little bit like the East Wing right now. So I'm going to just proceed ahead here. On the happy side, however, it's Humanities Week. And if you're in the humanities like our centers are, it's like Christmas or Hanukkah. It's a great time of year. It's a great time to showcase the events, the speakers, the programs that we undertake here at the center. And in this case, we at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict are really excited to be partnering with the Center for Jewish Studies on this event, and are delighted to bring to you what I think is going to be a very important, interesting, engaging, perhaps provocative talk today on certainly a timely issue. Before we introduce our speaker and get going, just a couple of standard housekeeping items. Turn off your cell phones. We are live streaming, so whatever you say will be encoded into perpetuity on the cloud or something. But I want to give a special welcome to our digital audience, and if you want to submit questions from online land, do so at csrc@asu.edu. You can just send them there, we'll get to them. For those of you who are in person, we're going to be doing question cards today. Will help us get through as many questions as possible. So jot your questions down on the card. Try to get those in by 5:15, 5:20. Help us out by submitting a brief question. All three of those things. A, one question. B, brief. Two, a question, right? Or three, a question. All right, so all of those things. There will also be a light reception afterwards. You may not know it, but hidden behind those doors is a wonderful spread, which we will avail to all of you as soon as the lecture is over. So stick around. I have one announcement about a future upcoming event that I want you to know about. We have just announced this. We're really excited about it. On Thursday, November 13th at 5:30 p.m., we, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, will be partnering with the Center for the Muslim Experience in the U.S. and the Tempe LDS Institute of Religion to hold an event called Muslims, Latter-day Saints, and Our Democratic Faith. And we'll feature two very distinguished speakers, one of whom you may have heard about. His name is Ambassador Jeff Flake, also the head of the Muslim Public Affairs Council in California will be present. Please do join us. We're going to be holding this event at the LDS Institute here on campus. We're excited to be doing that. And we'll be exploring some really important questions about the relationship between United States' religious diversity and religious heritage, and what its relationship is to democracy and the state of democracy today. So we hope you'll come to that event. Please put that on your calendars. It's on our website now as well. And bring a friend. There's going to be lots of room there. So we're doing it in a different place in part so we can accommodate all the people who'll be interested. Finally, on behalf of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict and the Center for Jewish Studies, I just want to thank all of our donors who are here tonight from both centers, those who make this work possible at a time particularly when the humanities are more important than ever, but are also in the crosshairs more than ever, either programs being gutted, dissolved, or openly kind of attacked. It's really important to remember what it is that we do, how we contribute to civic life and civic flourishing, and we're grateful to all of our supporters for your generous contributions to and as well as to the programs that support students and research as well. A couple, just two final points here. I'm going to turn things over to my esteemed colleague, Hava Torosh Samlis. At the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict sponsors a lot of events, and in the past few years, at least since October 7th, 3 or 4 different events on this topic. We deal with sensitive topics. If you disagree, you know what that means? You're in a university, right? That's fine. This is what we're here for, to explore different points of view. We're delighted that you're here, and I hope that you continue to come to events and hear different perspectives, particularly on important issues. Because if you're trying to avoid offending someone or saying something that's going to be disagreeable in some way, that means you're not engaging the issues of the day, and you're not getting some perspectives that need to be heard. I am so thrilled that we're going to have Professor Alan Mittleman to speak with us. We just had an incredible conversation with my class for about an hour. So we talked about hope. Hope as a civic virtue, hope as an aspiration, hope as a renunciation of despair. It was a really, really important topic. And I mentioned that in part because that's not going to be the topic that you're going to hear to talk about tonight. But don't forget the capaciousness of what the study of religion, study of Judaism brings to bear in our time in our world. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to my wonderful colleague, Hava Torah Samuelson, who was previously the director for the Center for Jewish Studies for many, many years. And because I made a scheduling boo-boo, I scheduled this event over the time when the current director is teaching a class. So that's why Hava's here, and delighted to have her here. Thank you.
All right, Joel, thank you. Yes. So I don't have to introduce myself because John did it. Just let me say a few words about Jewish studies here at ASU. It is a hybrid unit. Jewish studies offers a BA major as well as a certificate in Jewish studies. Well, Jewish studies also offers graduate training, but that you have to do through other academic units at ASU, primarily through the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, that's SHIPPERS for short, or the School of International Languages and Culture, that's SILK for short, or the School of Social Transformation. And what Jewish Studies is very well known for is its outreach program. Jewish Studies, in the 17 years that I've been the director, has offered guest lectures, research conferences, adult education courses, musical performances, and historical exhibits. We are known, or I shouldn't say we because I'm not the director anymore, but Jewish Studies is known both locally, nationally, and internationally. And I would like to bring to your attention this calendar of events as well as annual report. I believe there are more copies out there, so do take a copy and you can see what's available, what's going to happen what happened last year and what will happen this year. It's very interesting. And now to the context of this conversation. For the past 2 years, we all went through very difficult times, for all of us, whether you're Jew or non-Jew, an Israeli or Palestinian, whether you're a student or faculty person or an administrator in an American university. As we all know, unfortunately, anti-Semitism has risen its ugly head all over the world, including in the United States. And to some extent, anti-Semitism has been fueled by the policies of the Israeli government within Israel and toward the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. But in part, the shunning of Israel, that's what's going on right now, international shunning of Israel from the international scene, that reflects age-old hostilities toward Jews, and that may not have a lot to do with the current political issues that Israel and the Middle East is struggling with. The surprise attack of Hamas on October 7, 2023, destroyed 27 flourishing communities, killed 1,200 Israelis, raped numerous Israeli women, and abducted Israeli civilians and soldiers to Gaza, some of whom were murdered and others kept alive in subhuman conditions. Retaliating for the October 7 horrific attack, Israel declared war on Hamas, we all know that, but because Hamas used civilian population as human shield, the war led to massive loss of life of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, about 60,000 people, including women and children, widespread famine, and the breakdown of civic institutions. So Gaza now lies in ruins, but Hamas is not vanquished. And within Israel, the debate about the future of Gaza and the future relationship between Israel and the political aspirations of the Palestinians, that debate is still ongoing, and it's very, very intense right now. Israel is a house divided, and the coming year, during which there will be elections, will tell us how this internal debate will be decided, if it will be decided. The good news is that in the Middle East now, there is a sense of a new beginning. Under the leadership of the Trump administration, the United States, in collaboration with 30 nations, including many Arab states, imposed a ceasefire on Israel and Hamas. The remaining 20 living hostages were finally returned to Israel about 2 weeks ago, along with about half of those hostages that were murdered in captivity. Yet the ceasefire is rather shaky, and until all the remaining dead bodies are returned to Israel, for Israelis at least, the war will not be over and the recovery process will not commence. So we are now at a turning point. If matters are handled wisely, it could be the beginning of regional peace that will bring an end to the ongoing conflicts between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and between Israel and the Palestinians, who are seeking a separate state. The situation is very fluid, and the eruption of yet another war is still possible. The underlying issues, and they are political, religious, social, and cultural issues that have these conflicts, that have made these conflicts so bloody and so trenches, all of those issues are still with us, and they're hotly contested within Israel, as well as between Israel and the Arab neighbors, and I should say also between Israelis and American Jews. So Jewish Studies and the Center of the Study of Religion in Conflict have collaborated, as John Carlson just said a few minutes ago. We have collaborated before in several programs to try to make some sense of the complexity of this situation. And we are going to be able to do it a little bit better this afternoon with the help of Professor Mittleman. So Professor Mittleman is an Emeritus Professor, the Aaron Rabinowitz and Simon H. Rifkind Emeritus Professor of Jewish Philosophy at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He holds a BA and an MA from Brandeis University and a PhD in Religious Studies from Temple University. In his research and numerous publications, Professor Mittleman has focused on the intersection of Jewish thought and Western philosophy in regards to ethics, political theory, and religion. And indeed, he has wonderful books. I really think that if you want to learn how to write well, read his books. And the first book I would like to recommend is precisely the book that was discussed in John's class, Hope in a Democratic Age, Philosophy, Religion, and Political Theology. That's from 2009. Another book is Human Nature and Human Thought and Jewish Thought, Judaism's Case for Why Persons Matter. That's very important text. Also, that's from Princeton University Press, 2015. Most recently, he published Absurdity and the Meaning of Contemporary Philosophy and Jewish Thought. That's from Cambridge in 2023. And the book that is most relevant to this discussion this afternoon is Does Judaism Condone Violence? Holiness and Ethics in the Jewish Tradition. That came out also with Princeton 2018. So I highly recommend all of his books to you, and he writes with exceptional clarity and nuance about very complex philosophical, ethical, political, and religious issues. So the title for this afternoon's lecture, Torah and Tactics, Jewish Ethics, Just War, and the State of Israel. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mittleman to ASU and to Phoenix.
Good afternoon, and thank you, John and John Mark, for inviting me, and thank you, Chava, for the wonderful introduction. I have a written text. I'm going to read it at a lively pace. I got it just at 45 minutes, so if you're not enjoying it, just look at your watch and you'll see there. So our task this afternoon is to explore the ethics of war, both in the Jewish tradition and in general secular ethics. Accordingly, I'll say something about war in the Bible and about rabbinic interpretations, ancient and medieval, of relevant biblical texts. I'll also say something about the just war tradition, the norms in Western thought that govern moral conduct in war. These two traditions, the Jewish one and the secular one, flow together into Israeli military ethics. Israel as a, quote, Jewish and democratic state, and, quote, as a phrase in one of its basic laws puts it, acknowledges the authority of Western democratic norms of conduct in warfare. Jewish elements sometimes influence or intrude into this ethical and legal framework. After we have our bearings in these moral traditions, I'll apply them to the Gaza war. My aim here is to produce more light than heat. I'm sure that there is a range of deeply felt views in this room about Israeli conduct. My hope is to present a conceptual framework for thinking about its complexities. Nonetheless, I do not want to dilute ethical critique in endless complexity. Our analysis should be academic, but not merely academic. My moral evaluation will be quite negative. As someone raised within the tradition of liberal Zionism, it pains me to admit that Israel has done grievous harm to the Palestinian civilian population. I can't help but believe that Israel, in a deep sense, has lost its way. Nonetheless, Jews are asirei tikva, prisoners of hope, as the prophet Zechariah puts it, and I have to remain hopeful that it can find a better way forward. I hope that Jewish ethics can contribute to what is called cheshbon hanefesh, the moral introspection that the post-war situation requires. In the spirit of Jewish ethics, let me start with a text. In Genesis chapter 14, Abraham learns that his kinsman, Lot, has been taken captive by 4 foreign kings in the course of a war against 5 local Canaanite rulers. Lot had been allied with one of the 5, Bera, the king of Sodom, because he lived in that city. The 4 foreign kings, led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, defeated the 5. Lot, his family, and his possessions were dragged away by Chedorlaomer. The Bible, in a matter-of-fact tone, reports that Abraham assembled a war party of 318 retainers. Abraham and his troops pursued Chedorlaomer as far as Dan, in the north of Canaan, and then continued through the night to north of Damascus. He succeeded in reaching and crushing Chedorlaomer, rescuing Lot and returning to the south. It's a laconic story, told without elaboration or theological interpolation. Abraham acts with full initiative, agency, and competence on his own. There's no divine involvement. There's nothing of holy war. It's a secular occurrence with an air of historicity. The next chapter, Genesis 15, however, begins in the most unsecular way. God speaks to Abraham in a vision, reassuring him that he should not be afraid. God will be his shield. The Midrash, a form of rabbinic interpretation that often serves as a vehicle for ethical and theological reflection, responds to the implicit question. Abraham's already won the battle. Why should he be afraid? The Midrash then depicts Abraham as conscience-stricken. He has killed men. What if among those guilty people who kidnapped his nephew Lot, there were also innocent people? Quote, what if among those people whom I killed, there was one righteous, one God-fearing man? Tzaddik echad, yirei shamayim echad, Abraham asks. God reassures Abraham that everyone he killed was guilty, presumably relieving him of his burdened conscience. Abraham engaged in cheshbon hanefesh, moral introspection. His pangs of conscience expressed what the just war tradition calls the need for distinction or discrimination. While soldiers in a justly fought war can be killed, they must be distinguished from non-combatants who may not. There is a much higher bar to meet if the killing of enemy non-combatants is to be anything other than murder. Although Abraham's distinction is not exactly that of combatant, non-combatant, it has the same resonance in the rabbinic idiom. It is not permitted to kill certain people on the enemy side. Abraham applies the categories of good and evil, righteous and wicked to strangers. Although he is the father of a particular people, he speaks a language of universal morality. It is the same language he uses when he challenges God over the fate of Sodom. He presses God to spare Sodom if there are 50 righteous people in the city. After repeated interventions, God agrees to spare the city, even if it only has 10 righteous people. Sodom, of course, failed that test. Abraham's temerity was based on his belief in a universal standard of guilt and innocence, which bound divine justice as much as human judgment. It is vital to keep this Abrahamic commitment to the universal in mind. Especially today, there is too much morally perverse contemporary Jewish thought which claims that Jewish lives have higher value than non-Jewish lives. In my view, this is invidious nonsense. In our shared world, we do best to take our ethical bearings from Abraham. Abraham raises a moral question about his own conduct. This is fundamental to Jewish ethics, but is it germane to war? A few moments ago, I used the phrase ethics of war, but can there be such a thing? Given that war is the vilest thing in human life, as Tolstoy put it, what place, if any, is there for ethics when human beings are killing other human beings en masse? Is it a fool's errand to try and control the evil of war by claiming that the conduct of the belligerents should be answerable to moral norms? Indeed, some so-called realist thinkers, such as Machiavelli, Hobbes, and the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, reject the application of ethics to war altogether. If that view were correct, it would be a challenge to Judaism, or at least to Jewish ethics. For these realists, the locus classicus is Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And since this is Humanities Week, I'll say something about Thucydides. The Athenians want to conquer the people of the island of Milos. They offer the Melians subjugation rather than death. The Melians try to have a dialogue with the Athenians. They try to appeal to shared universal principles of justice, fairness, dignity, and liberty. The Athenians, however, say that they will not make fine speeches about ethical concepts. They needn't regard the Melians' appeals because only equal parties can talk about justice. Since the Melians are militarily weak, the Athenians say infamously that, quote, there is no justice between the weak and the strong. The strong take what they can and the weak suffer what they must, end quote. Like the Athenians, the realist implicitly denies a shared moral universe despite discrepancies in power. He rejects a common human status and moral stature. For the realist, justice and other values under conditions of unequal force are illusory. In war, the only principle needed is might makes right. Cicero summed it up well. Inter arma silant leges. In times of war, the law is silent. So from this point of view, the idea of morally justified war or moral conduct in war is empty. War is an ethics and law-free zone. The counter-argument basically asks, what happens to us, to our conscience, to our souls, when we really believe that? Can we look into the eyes of a non-combatant child and say, suffer as you must? When we define justice down or define it out of existence, we diminish or abandon our own humanity. In Jewish religious language, we diminish the image of God, Tselem Elokim, in the human. By contrast, to insist that ethical constraints do bear on war, no matter how much they are violated in actual fact, is to hold the imperatives of justice, and so of ourselves as morally responsible beings, constant, even in wartime. It is to hold on to a hope for a more ethical future, a more humane life together. And this is especially important for democratic societies, where soldiers represent states that base their legitimacy on the foundational human values enshrined in their constitutions. The troops need to believe that they're risking their lives for these values and not for arbitrary, capricious, or morally despicable ends. Thus, codes of military conduct at the level of the individual soldier typically remind him or her of the constitutive values of the society he or she fights for on the battlefield. The other denier of ethics in war is the pacifist, but time does not permit an exploration of that view here. It fell to the great Christian thinker, St. Augustine, to argue for a third way. Christianity before him was pacifistic. After all, Jesus taught that one should love one's enemy. Early Christians considered it a sin to fight for a pagan state in a pagan army. Augustine wrote after the empire had officially become Christian. He wanted to justify Christian participation in warfare on behalf of the now Christian state. For a war to be just, he taught, it had to be declared for the right reasons with the right intention. The right reasons were self-defense against aggression, especially the defense of the innocents among us, or to punish wrongdoers who have acted against God. Traditional reasons for going to war, such as glory, wealth, territorial expansion, were impermissible. Nor could war be justified if the intention was to satisfy base instincts like aggression, lust, vengeance, or rage. As the tradition founded by Augustine developed, it was concerned with discerning stringent, morally justifiable reasons for going into war, declaring war. Now, these are called, a little Latin here, jus ad bellum, justice into war, jus ad bellum criteria. The tradition was also concerned with conduct in war itself, which it calls jus in bello, in the war criteria. So let's see how this works. As to jus ad bellum, justice of going into war, first, to fight justly, one must have just cause. Since war involves death and destruction, the cause it serves must be worth the suffering it inflicts. Just causes are few and far between. Traditionally, only two are recognized: national defense and humanitarian intervention. Israel's aims in going to war against Hamas were first those of national defense against an aggressor and the rescue of hostages. In my view, Israel had just cause. Second, war should only be declared by a properly constituted political body. This is called legitimate authority. Just war theory envisions that a just war is declared by a political entity that rules in a responsible manner. This makes the warfare of non-state actors as well as rogue states arguably inherently unjust. In my view, some of the university protesters early on who believed that Israel had no such legitimacy, who saw it as an apartheid settler colonial state whose self-defense was thereby automatically unjust. From their point of view, which I don't share, Israel failed the legitimate authority test, such that its war was unjust in advance of any actual conduct. Third, the legitimate political authority declaring a state of war intends only to achieve the just cause. Right intention restricts the purpose of the war. It disallows using war as a pretext to achieve wrongful ends, such as ethnic cleansing or dispossession. Such wrongful intentions were indeed voiced by some of the most extreme elements of the Israeli government. For the war to be just, one has to believe that those vicious views, sometimes countered by others in the government, were not the decisive intentions that motivated the war. The two other ad bellum considerations are the criteria of proportionality and last resort, also called necessity. Proportionality means that the moral goods to be achieved by the war outweigh the moral harms that the war will cause. If there's no way to pursue one's military goals without inflicting disproportionate harm, the just war tradition would dictate scaling down one's goals. And finally, war should be a last resort. If there are other means of resolving conflict, these should be tried. If they've been exhausted, then war is a necessity. These criteria jointly impose tests, such as, are there really no other alternatives to war? Can more targeted martial measures accomplish the same aims as a full-fledged war with lesser harm? Once undertaken, did the war go on longer than is necessary? Is the harm done counterbalanced by, proportional to, the good achieved, or is the harm excessive and disproportionate to the good achieved? In my view, the state of Israel comes in for strong criticism on these points. The war went on longer than was necessary, and the harm inflicted was disproportionate to the goods achieved. Now, use in bello, justice in war. Once war begins, the tradition holds three moral principles should govern its conduct. The first principle is distinction, sometimes called discrimination. There's a morally crucial distinction between combatants and non-combatants. One must distinguish between them. Intentionally targeting non-combatants is always immoral and legally forbidden. Of course, despite one's lack of intention, one can foresee that some non-combatants will be harmed anyway. This is called double effect. The primary effect is to harm enemy forces. The secondary or double effect is unintended harm to civilians. The principle of proportionality in bello attempts to address this secondary effect. Proportionality here means that the collateral harm to non-combatants, that is, harming them foreseeably but unintentionally, is permissible only if the harms are proportional to the goals of the attack. If the goal, say, is to take out snipers on the roof of a building occupied by civilians, it would be disproportionate to blow up the whole building when you could use precision means to hit the snipers. It is never permissible to intentionally target civilians, but given that some are likely to be harmed, the harm must be proportioned to a suitably weighty good. Civilian life should never be cheap. But how much risk should one's own troops be exposed to in order to spare the civilians of the other side? Dropping a bomb on the building is disproportionate. It's safer for one's own, but it's safer for one's own troops than sending them into the building. Agonizing choices like these are crucial if proportionality is to have teeth. Finally, the criterion of necessity in bello means that collateral harm to non-combatants is permissible only if the least harmful means possible are chosen. For example, if one can kill a terrorist on the road in a car with his driver, or kill him in his home surrounded by his whole family, necessity would dictate killing on the road. It's important to point out that this tradition that I just outlined emerged in a world very different from our own. It assumes conditions which barely pertained to the Gaza war. The traditional scenario envisions military formations in uniform on a discrete field of battle, arrayed symmetrically against one another. It's relatively easy to distinguish combatants from non-combatants and to take effective measures to lessen harm to the latter. The conditions in Gaza did not correspond at all to this scenario. Gaza is a case of asymmetric warfare. One side doesn't wear uniforms. It's deeply embedded in the civilian population. There's no defined space called the front. The combatant-non-combatant distinction is deliberately blurred. And needless to say, asymmetric conditions pose innumerable problems for the just war framework. Nonetheless, the difficulty of applying just war principles to these conditions does not imply their irrelevance. There are still moral obligations in warfare despite the difficulty of meeting them. Turning now to Jewish teachings on war, I find a general pattern. Although Judaism does not have a clearly codified set of principles like those of the just war tradition, it has a long tradition of ethical reflection on difficult texts that works in a moralizing, humanizing direction. It emphasizes restraint and putting moral limits on violence. From the outset of Jewish reflection, there is ambivalence on the use of force. In the Bible, war can be a normal and acceptable part of life, as we saw with Abraham. But the Bible also expresses disapproval. There are hefty prophetic condemnations of the disproportionate use of force, as in Amos chapter 1. Amos condemns various nations for violating tacit international standards of warfare. The prophets have fervent hopes for a world in which war is unnecessary and swords are beaten into plowshares. This notwithstanding, the biblical authors do endorse Joshua's use of force in conquering Canaan. They endorse King David's discretionary wars against his pagan neighbors and see God's hand in his subjugation of them. Yet it's also true that the Bible sees David as unfit to build the temple because he has blood on his hands. The Bible disallows the use of carved stones, which would require a sword to cut them, for building the altar. The holy place that gives life would be profaned by that which takes it away. This biblical ambivalence toward force is heightened by the rabbis. Before Israel became a nation, its patriarchs were no strangers to armed conflict. In addition to Abraham, Jacob's sons, Shimon and Levi, tricked and then slaughtered all the Canaanites in this town of Shechem to avenge the rape of their sister, Dinah. Jacob condemns them forcefully on his deathbed for their lawlessness. The medieval commentator, Nachmanides, argues that Jacob was angry at his sons for failing to distinguish between the guilty party in the rape of their sister, namely the prince of the town, and the rest of the people. They violated the principle of distinction, so to speak, by killing everyone. Nachmanides also claimed that Shimon and Levi deliberately lied to the people of Shechem, promising them that they would become one kin with Jacob's family if they circumcised themselves. On that basis, the people of Shechem trusted them, circumcised themselves, and chose to believe in God, according to Nachmanides. They might have entered a process of complete repentance. Shimon and Levi thus destroyed all of that without restraint or discernment. The rabbis took the biblical laws of war and organized them in terms of two kinds of war, two classes of treatment. The first and main kind of war is what they call the milchemet mitzvah or milchemet chovah, meaning commanded or obligatory war. These were wars to conquer the land of Canaan, as well as wars of self-defense against foreign invaders, such as the Philistines. The second kind of war they called milchemet reshut, discretionary or permitted war. The rabbis devised this kind of war to justify the wars of King David, some of which were intended to expand territory and acquire wealth. And here we see discretionary war gives carte blanche to a king's wishes to magnify his power. Here we see a complete mismatch between the Jewish framework and the just war tradition. In fact, however, the rabbis effectively rule out discretionary war as a live option. In order to proclaim one, you'd need a king, a Sanhedrin, and the priestly oracle. Lacking all of these conditions, discretionary war is literally passé. Moreover, in rabbinic interpretation, the obligatory wars against the Canaanites were completed in the biblical age. Thus, in the rabbinic interpretation of Scripture, little is left of justified in the sense of divinely commanded war. What remains are basically two possibilities: wars of self-defense, which are understood to be commanded, and the peculiar case of a war against Amalek, a fierce desert tribe that attacked Israel during the Exodus from Egypt. Even though the rabbis consign the commandment to make war against the Canaanite nations to ancient history, the biblical texts retain a disturbing resonance. These biblical texts are among the most troubling in Scripture. Nonetheless, the way that the rabbis, and especially the great medieval philosopher and codifier Maimonides, handled them show great moral sensitivity. They illumine how Jewish ethics tries to retain warfare. So just one word about this. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, and again in Deuteronomy 20, the Torah commands that the 7 Canaanite nations be completely exterminated. Every man, woman, and child must be killed. The Israelites must not enter into treaties with them or allow any of them to survive. We might anachronistically call such wars genocidal. The Canaanites are, the Hebrew term is cherem. The Torah gives a reason for this commandment. The Canaanites are idolaters who will turn the Israelites away from God, on account of which God will then have to destroy the Israelites as well. Because God has made the Israelites a holy people, Am Kadosh, they have to destroy utterly the holy sites of the Canaanites. You shall tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred posts, and consign their images to the fire, says Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy envisions what is effectively a holy war that will cleanse the holy land for the holy people, in the midst of which the Holy One of Israel will dwell on earth. Astute readers recognize that the Bible has many voices. The book of Exodus contrasts with Deuteronomy. It envisions not a genocidal holy war, but a gradual displacement of the Canaanites by the Israelites. Similarly, later books, such as parts of Joshua and most of Judges, picture the settlement of the land not as a decisive conquest, but as a protracted project with an enduring Canaanite population. The Israelites do indeed make treaties with the Canaanites and intermarry with them. There are reasons to doubt, therefore, that the total war, cherem, was ever actually implemented. The rabbinic tradition qualifies and restrains the force of the cherem. The rabbis worry about why whole peoples were consigned to destruction. It is, after all, fundamental to Jewish law that one is only liable to a death penalty if one has been warned in advance about the consequences of one's actions. Accordingly, the rabbis portray Joshua as sending letters to the Canaanites to encourage them to flee or to become Noachides, non-Jewish worshippers of God. Only if they choose to fight will the horrendous consequences follow. The rabbis take the legal procedures that constrain capital punishment in civil society and apply them to the war, quite anachronistically, against the Canaanites. Now, Maimonides builds on this and goes even further. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, the Torah requires that when the army approaches a town to conquer it, it must first offer peace terms. If the town accepts, all of its people will be spared, although they'll have to serve the Israelites as laborers thereafter. If the town does not surrender, then after its conquest, the males will be killed, the females and the children shall remain alive. These terms, the Torah states, should only be offered to towns, quote, very far off from you, rechokot ma'od mimecha. Read literally, this would doom the Canaanite nations since they're nearby. And for them, you shall not let a soul remain alive, the cherem. Maimonides, in very creative interpretation, and Maimonides is doing this in the 12th century, breaks sharply from the literal sense of this commandment. In his judgment, the Israelites offered peace terms to both the towns far off and to the Canaanites near at hand. Had the Canaanites accepted surrender, there would have been no cherem. Maimonides cites the tradition about Joshua sending letters to the Canaanites to persuade them to come to terms. He then enunciates a standing principle. Ein osim milchama im adam ba'olam ad shekorin lo shalom. We don't make war with anyone at all in the world until we offer him terms of shalom. Given that the Canaanites rejected shalom, Maimonides can do no other than endorse the biblical commandment to kill them. Importantly, however, he stresses that the commandment has already been fulfilled. He, like the rabbis, reads it to apply only to those bygone nations. Since the upheavals of the Assyrian conquest of Israel in biblical times, all of those nations have vanished. One could not identify a Canaanite even if one wanted to. Thus, the mitzvah of total war is inapplicable, a dead letter. The most important upshot of this is that modern Israel's wars against Arab nations and the Palestinians should in no way be analogized to the wars against the Canaanites. Such an equation is deeply irresponsible and must be fought at every level of the educational system and in public discourse. The book of Joshua, the Israeli biblical scholar Moshe Greenberg wrote, should only be taught in schools with its rabbinic midrashim in order to prevent contemporary Israelis from seeing themselves as ancient Israelites. Maimonides extends the schema as well to Amalek, that desert tribe that slaughtered the Israelites after the Exodus, the weakest ones, and it's subject to this commandment to have their memory blotted out. In principle, this is an ongoing obligation, but Maimonides treats it as such. But he also includes Amalek in the same conditions for accepting peace as must be offered to the ancient Canaanites. Maimonides envisioned that an Amalekite can repent from evil and become a follower of Noah, a civilized human being on the Jewish view. In the 20th century, various Jewish teachers applied the category of Amalek to implacable enemies of the Jews, such as the Nazis, and unfortunately, some even to the Palestinians. Maimonides is an important ethical corrective to this. The upshot of his approach is to see enemies not as embodiments of metaphysical evil, but as sinning human beings who might, like the rest of us, be capable of moral discernment. The Talmud states that the Torah as a whole was given only mipnei darchei shalom, to advance the ways of peace. Nonetheless, with the return to statehood in 1948, Jews returned to war, not as its hapless victims or as soldiers in another nation's army, but as having an army of their own. It's important to emphasize that the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, although it contains many religious Jews, is not run according to Jewish law. Strictly speaking, the Jewish law that I've tried to explain is not at all relevant to it. Nonetheless, Israeli Orthodox rabbis associated with religious Zionism have continued to develop the laws of war, which have largely been quiescent since Maimonides' codification. Many Orthodox soldiers seek religious guidance at a personal level. Occasionally, Israeli philosophers who study the moral problems of war advise the government on codes of conduct that draw from traditional Jewish sources. Most of their analyses, however, rely on the secular just war tradition that I talked about at the beginning of the paper. And my judgments now will also rely on those secular just war principles. I said at the outset that while I believe Israel had just cause, I'm not sure whether it had right intention, nor am I convinced that as the war went on into 2024, it continued to meet the threshold for necessity. Consider right intention first. On October 28, 2023, Netanyahu, referring to the IDF entering Gaza, addressed the Israeli public in these words: "They," that is the soldiers, "are longing to recompense the murderers for the horrific acts they perpetrated on our children, our women, our parents, and our friends. They're committed to eradicating this evil from the world. For our existence, and I add, for the good of all humanity, the entire people and the leadership of the people, embrace them and believe in them. Remember what Amalek did to you. We remember and we will fight." Similarly, then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, in announcing a total siege of Gaza, said, "We're fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly." 6 months in, the Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, also invoked Amalek, calling for total annihilation. How are we to take exclamations such as these? As rhetorical appeals to encourage a reeling nation, or as rules of engagement, as marching orders? The most severe accusations against Israel, the ones that accuse it of genocide, take these as statements of intent, of genocidal intent. I personally am unsure whether that reading is justified, but I am sure that it was deeply irresponsible for leaders with legitimate authority to use such language. Regarding necessity, given the wholesale slaughter of 1,200 Israeli and other civilians on October 7th, as well as the kidnapping of 251 hostages, an armed response was necessary. I don't think that any state on earth would have done otherwise. The problem is whether the initial necessity continued. An extensive story in the New York Times on July 27th of this year details how Netanyahu had developed a plan for a long-term ceasefire with Hamas. He was ready to compromise and had sent an envoy to Egyptian mediators. This was in April 2024. Having kept the plan a secret, he was ready to unveil it at a cabinet meeting. He had the paper right in front of him. Right before doing so, Smotrich suddenly announced that if a, quote, surrender agreement, end quote, was brought forward, his party would bolt the coalition and Netanyahu's government would fall. Smotrich then pressed Netanyahu on this, and Netanyahu lied to his face that he had planned any such move. From then on, Netanyahu did whatever he could to keep his government intact, thereby prolonging the war beyond the requirement of military necessity and causing tens of thousands more civilian deaths, as well as prolonging the agony of the hostages and their families. Quote, forced to choose between the chance of a truce and his political survival, Netanyahu opted for survival, according to the Israeli journalist Ronen Bergman. Another area of major concern, of course, is the insufficient discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, resulting in a disproportionate level of harm to civilians and damage to critical infrastructure, especially hospitals and medical clinics. The scale of death and destruction is unprecedented in the post-war period. The current death toll is roughly 68,000 persons, of whom 20,000 are children. As these figures are provided by the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry and do not distinguish between combatants and civilians, Israeli spokespersons typically reject their reliability. However, leaked Israeli military intelligence data paint an equally grim picture. In May 2025, the leaked Israeli data indicate that 53,000 Gazans had been killed to date, among them 8,900 fighters. The fighters thus accounted for 17% of the casualties, the non-combatants for 83%. For every fighter killed, almost 5 civilians were killed. In other modern conflicts, civilian casualties have rarely run as high as 67%. A civilian casualty rate of 83% is extreme. Proportionality is not a numbers game, but numbers do matter. The former head of the IDF, General Herzi Halevi, admitted that more than 200,000 Palestinians, 10% of Gaza's population, have been killed or injured in the course of the war. Furthermore, he confirmed that, quote, not once in the course of military operations were his or his subordinates' commands inhibited by legal advice. Halevi said, this is not a gentle war. We took the gloves off from the first minute, sadly not earlier. Yoav Gallant at the cabinet meeting on October 7th, the defense minister, stated flatly, our response won't be proportional. Commenting on whether Israel's response was proportional, Professor Asa Kasher of Tel Aviv University, not a man of the left, the leading scholar of war ethics in Israel, judged that the number of non-combatants killed, quote, seems too high to be taken to result from reasonable proportionality considerations, end quote. Israel seems to have set proportionality aside. I can well understand the rage, the violation, the overwhelming feeling of vulnerability because of the massacres of October 7th. But I can't understand the wholesale diminution of the worth of non-combatants' lives in the war that followed. The image of God, a core concept of Jewish ethics, is shared by Jews and non-Jews. Whatever necessity dictated should have been proportioned to the restraints that acknowledged that image. My last point. Another moral tragedy was the blockade of aid that prevented food and medical supplies from reaching Gazans. Restrictions began early in the war, but a total blockade began in March 2025 with the breakdown of a ceasefire. The Geneva Conventions, to which Israel is a signatory, prohibit using food as a weapon of war. This is one domain where Jewish law and ethics has something direct to say. Maimonides rules that when a Jewish army besieges a city, it must leave one side of the city open so that the residents can flee. The reason seems to be both humanitarian and discouraging the remaining fighters who see their compatriots abandoning the city. Nachmanides, his near contemporary, wrote, "It is from this commandment that we learn to deal compassionately, even with our enemies, even at a time of war." End quote. One might think that this is a completely impractical theoretical commandment, but Rabbi Shlomo Goren, former chief rabbi of Israel and a major theorist of the Jewish laws of war, ruled that during the 1982 siege of Beirut, one side of the city had to be left open. One can understand the tactical reasons for sealing off Gaza, but the moral and legal obligations of a state to the civilian population that comes under its control are clearly laid out in international humanitarian law, which Israel is also obliged to follow. In sum, while Hamas is responsible for the slaughter of October 7th, for hostage taking, and for deliberately embedding in densely populated civilian areas, their responsibility, deep responsibility, does not relieve Israel of its responsibilities. It should have acted with greater restraint and greater adherence to the laws and ethics of war. I believe that the cumulative weight of millennia of Jewish ethics would agree. The hope for Israel's future as a dignified and responsible member of the family of nations rests on its compliance with what is best in its own Jewish moral tradition. Thank you.
Professor Mittleman, thank you so much for your talks, for your wisdom, for your deep, deep research and preparation for this topic. You more than rose to the occasion, I think, for what we asked, and we're very, very grateful. The reflection and the introspection, as you discussed in your paper, is taking place within this room here as well. So we have some questions, and I'll start with one that's a little on the longer side and a little harder to read because it's in pencil. So we're going to add a new rule: and a question, brief, and in pen. But for the time being, here we go. So, how much damage? This is from Samantha Markle. How much damage do you believe Israel's tactics in the past 2 years have caused to the future image of Judaism in both the Middle East and the Western world? And in addition to that, how have Israel's actions affected your own Jewish identity, your own view of Judaism, or place within the tradition overall?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. I mean, this from October 7th to the present has been described as, an existential moment for Israel and the Jewish people. I think existential, not exactly in the sense that the very survival of the state of Israel was in danger, but I think this is a pivotal moment these past 2 years in Jewish history and in Jewish consciousness. Part of what animated the Jewish moral sources in teaching about war and Jewish ethics in general is acting in the world in such a way as can be described by the Hebrew phrase Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God. That is, when people see Jews acting, they should say, look at the honesty there, look at the integrity there, look at how this person honors his or her maker by this kind of ethical action in the world. The opposite of that is called Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name in the world. It's probably not possible to have war in any way that acts as Kiddush Hashem. It brings out the absolute worst in us. But this very, desperate attempt to try to hold on to a moral tradition is as close as you could come, I think, to rising to what Jewish ethics expects of us. I found a very interesting little book that there is circulating in Israel, and I wrote to the publisher and was able to get a copy of it. It's a pamphlet about 50 pages long called Shmirat HaNefesh, basically guarding one's soul or protecting one's own moral nature. It's a compilation of Jewish ethical teachings for Israeli soldiers about how to try to keep their heads and recognize the humanity of the enemy. It's an astonishing document, and it's meant to offset some truly awful material that came out over a decade ago from the extreme right. So one way I thought about maybe doing this talk, I opted for something more instructional, let's say, is to talk about two wars, the Gaza war and the war over the future of Judaism, the war for the Jewish soul, not just in Israel, but also among us. And how has it affected me? I mean, I've been critical of Israel in a kind of connected critic, basically loyal way for a long time. But this war has really put into question a whole host of assumptions that I've had for basically ever since I was a college student. It's been an existential crisis for me. So I felt I could only accept the invitation to give this talk if I could speak honestly. And that had to come not just from the heart, it had to come from thinking hard about these issues, not wanting to get swept up in either kind of robotic pro-Israel justifications that come from, many people I know, particularly in the Orthodox movement with which I associate myself. But nor did I want to jump on a bandwagon of kind of already by the first week absolute condemnation of Israel. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Testes. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay, good. Reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please grab a comment card and jot it down, pass it to the end of the aisle. And if you're watching online, send your question to csrc@asu.edu. So is it comment card? Should we get some comment card down this way, please? Thank you. Here's a question about the role of the United States or other nations in following certain moral norms, ethics of justice, etc., as you laid out in support of the war in Israel. What would you say to that? What would other nations' responsibilities be?
Responsibilities toward Israel or toward the conduct of their own wars?
No, towards Israel. And for example, I'm thinking, this is not on the card, but I'm thinking, for example, the United States provided a great number of weapons to Israel in this conduct that were used in the conflict.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Biden talked last year about how Israel should dial down the intensity of the war and start doing more targeted surgical measures. And that was the right thing to advocate, but he didn't push for it. And Trump has obviously been baffling. I mean, on one hand, he gave them, he gave the Israelis carte blanche to pretty much do whatever they wanted to do, and he did not really put the screws on Israel, and then he did. So I think, I mean, I would have wanted more pressure from the Biden administration and initially from the Trump administration. And I think that ultimately the long-term viability of Israel, not just as a state, but as a decent society, to try to gain decency as a society. This book, The Decent Society, is by one of the leading Israeli moral philosophers, Avishai Margalit. It's not about Israel, but you can read between the lines. He talks about how a decent society is one that gives every person dignity. So I think that, sorry, I lost my point. I lost where I was going with this.
That's okay. We have lots of other
Lots of questions.
You're right back on track. I'm going to ask two questions that sort of ask you to take a different positioning or position yourself for thinking about Hamas or other groups. One question is sort of general. This is from Maggie. Asks what makes a group of people a legitimate power that's able to declare war? And I might think about, for example, in this case, or some kind of resistance movement, if that exists. Another one's more specific. This one from Tim. Why or did Hamas meet the just cause criteria, even if you perhaps disagreed with or condemned the tactics that were used? What would that look like to try to invoke a just cause criteria in the case of a movement, again, an insurgent movement?
That's a challenging question. I don't think Hamas has a justification for committing the atrocities that it committed on October 7th. And I found someone who used to work a block from Columbia University, like, had the luck to retire a couple of months before October 7th, 2023, where the demonstrations began at Columbia. And it was very clear early on when people were saying things like, this is what resistance looks like. If resistance looks like, slaughtering 1,200 people in Nazi-level barbarity and having a movement that's basically founded on the genocidal elimination of Jews within the 1967 borders of the State of Israel, I can't see that as a movement that could constitute a legitimate authority. It's true that Gazans voted for them, however many years ago it's been now. But I think many Gazans have turned against them even before October 7th, 2023, because they're a highly oppressive regime. I think that the legitimate claims of the Palestinian people and the arrangements, whether it's a two-state solution or a federal solution, ideally more like Switzerland than Bosnia, those should not be confused with the goals of an organization like Hamas.
This next question comes from Carol Rickel. What's your view of the continuing expansion of Jewish settlements?
Oh, my goodness. I went to Israel for the first time as a rising junior in college in 1974. And I didn't get back to Israel until 1984. A lot happened in that period. And I remember in 1984, I was working for a Jewish organization in New York, the American Jewish Committee, and I went on a staff trip to learn about the situation on the ground. And one of the places we went to was a West Bank settlement. And it was a settlement that was particularly, it wasn't just, a suburb where people could get cheap housing for commuting to Tel Aviv or to Jerusalem. It was a very ideological settlement. I remember sitting with these people and hearing them talk with great fervor about how they are the only real Israelis left, and they're continuing the project, of the last century and being pioneers and all of this stuff. And something at that time stirred in me. I said, yeah, I could see how they think that. I could see how they think that settling on this barren hilltop, is part of this project with which I basically agree. Zionism understood within this kind of democratic structure. But I thought, even at that time, in 1984, these people have a good intention, but what they're doing is morally wrong. Other people live on this land, and they're pushing these people away, and they're subjugating these people. And I felt, I don't know, I think that was sort of the birth of my dovishness on these matters. I just felt that there was, however well-intentioned and sincere, perhaps, these people were, they stood for a policy that ultimately could not be morally justified. And I've never really accepted the idea, which has been a sort of leading Netanyahu idea, that if there can just be, a regional peace and a treaty with Saudi Arabia and something like that, and Israel finds acceptance in the region at the interstate level, then the Palestinian problem will sort of take care of itself. It will normalize. It's really not a big irritant. I continue to see it as the chief moral irritant of the Jewish sovereignty in the Middle East. And I think the constant attempt to sort of put it on the back burner only makes things much worse.
Thank you. Next question. Can you say a bit more about the term or use of human shields by Hamas? Does this justify Israel's widespread attack? And does that is that something that's permitted within the just war? You addressed some of this briefly, but maybe you could say just reiterate or say a few more words.
Yeah, I don't think I can address that exactly. I mean, there's when people say something like a people, mostly Jews, and they say that the Gaza population voted for Hamas, so they're all guilty. The kind of rallying cry of the far right in Israel was, there are no innocents in Gaza. This absolutely horrific book that I critiqued about 12 years ago. It's called Mishpat HaMelech. It looks like a sober halachic Jewish law code that is a kind of gloss on Maimonides' laws of war. It advocates things like killing enemy children so they don't grow up to be full-fledged anti-Semites and turn into enemies with arms. So that was part of what motivated writing my book. Sure, does Judaism condone violence? And I mentioned that book in there. So my sense is that it's always wrong to kill non-combatants, Nonetheless, non-combatants will be killed for various reasons. They shouldn't be killed deliberately. Can you discriminate between different levels of non-combatant? I've heard it said that Hitler, in a sense, couldn't be killed under the laws of war, under the criterion of discrimination, because he was not a member of the army. He was a civilian, in a sense. This is an attempt to sort of tear down the whole conception of distinction. If a combatant, while not being in uniform, so to speak, a member of the combatant forces, if a non-combatant is part of the chain of causality leading to atrocities or leading to the belligerence, that non-combatant is at greater risk than a non-combatant who's at home minding his or her own business. It seems to me a human shield is by definition, however useful, to the combatant, that person is a full non-combatant who's there unwillingly. One thing I didn't develop at all in the talk, but it's really a big topic, is you really have to put your own troops at a lot of risk in order to be targeted and precise. And a lot of the destruction, or 92% of the buildings of Gaza are either destroyed or uninhabitable. But a lot of that is aerial bombardment, which is indiscriminate. So you have to expose your own troops. A real serious question is, whose life is worth more? Your troop or a non-combatant civilian of the enemy side? Or are they worth the same? How much is the life of that non-combatant civilian worth? Someone I respect greatly, someone I know and esteem, is Michael Walzer. Michael Walzer wrote a very powerful article arguing that the non-combatant of the civilian of the enemy that life should have exactly the same worth as your civilians, the civilians you're fighting to protect. That should be the principle that governs your treatment in war.
I think we're going to have this be the last question, but a reminder that there is going to be a reception afterwards, and if you did not get your question answered, please pose it to Professor Mittleman during the Q&A. This is from Marcel, former student of mine. Are there any pacifist texts in the Jewish canon, or anything that sort of leans in that direction that would provide insight or a guidance that's something different than what you've already shared today? I know you sort of lost a little bit of pacifism.
I left out the pacifism paragraph because so there is a Jewish Peace Fellowship. It was founded as a sort of Jewish analog to the Quaker movement. It goes back to the Second World War. There is one important 20th century Jewish philosopher named Stephen Schwarzschild, who was a pacifist and who kind of marshaled texts to support a pacifist outlook. You could find, alles steht in Gemara, as they say. Everything is in the Talmud. You could find texts to support a pacifist point of view, but I think Judaism is not a pacifistic tradition because it thinks at it largely thinks at the level of a people, and I think pacifism is the work of very conscientious individuals. And pacifism, I think, is a perfectly legitimate moral position if you're not making policy for a nation. if you're willing to suffer the consequences of your own pacifism, or if you live in an insular group like the Amish or the Mennonites and accept martyrdom rather than harm to another, that's impressive. But I think at a collective level, it's suicidal. Collective meaning a national level. So it's a fundamental axiom in the ancient rabbinic interpretation of Judaism that if someone comes to kill you, kill him first. That's what they say. But as that law gets worked out, so in other words, there's a right of self-defense. But as that gets worked out, if you can, shoot an arrow into his leg rather than take his head off with a sword, do the former. So that's proportionality, right? It's also kind of last resort. So I think that Judaism sort of very much preaches peace, valorizes peace, tries to advocate for holding on to the dignity of persons even in wartime. This wonderful book, which I can show you at the reception, by an Israeli sort of peace advocate named Michael Manikin. He was motivated to write it because he was occupying an Arab village when he was in the army, and he found himself becoming so coarse, so out of touch with the humanity of the other. He had to relieve himself. He relieved himself on the wall of a house with this Arab woman sitting outside, her grandmother. And she just looked at him with total disgust. So what kind of animal does something like this? He was an Orthodox Jew, and he felt absolutely sick. He felt so angry with himself for doing this that he felt he needed a total sort of change of mindset. So he's founded this wonderful movement called Smol Emuni, the faithful left, to try to rebuild a kind of religious Zionist left against this much more tribal, hard-right, nationalistic takeover of Zionism. But it came out of a sense of what it is to acknowledge the dignity of the other and to learn to hold on to your own.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you feel intellectually nourished. I hope you feel intellectually challenged, that you feel morally reflective, and that you'll have lots and lots of good conversations this week as you ponder this, conversations with yourselves and with friends, with family, and that you'll once again thank the Dr. Mittleman for sharing his wisdom with us and for giving us so much to think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.